In the last few years, secular society has slipped into a critical theory mood where group categories like race, gender, and class determine who's right and who's wrong about nearly everything. These bad ideas have been advanced in the media and in classrooms. They've even affected the church. As these ideas increasingly touch daily life, Christians must be equipped to evaluate and push back against the claims of critical theory with discernment, truth, and love. To help us do this, Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer have written a comprehensive analysis of critical theory from a Christian perspective in their latest book, Critical Dilemma. They guide us to respond to various forms of critical theory with God's truth. We'll send you a copy of this important and timely book as a thank you for your gift to the Colson Center in October at colsoncenter.org/upcriticaldilemma. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. Music means the world to me. It's given form to laments in my lowest moments, served as a vehicle for the most important truths I've ever learned, and given me a peerless tool with which to praise God and celebrate His work. And that's why I've often invited musicians on Upstream to explore the deep significance of this art form, the way it touches us on a precognitive level, and its power to communicate with the human experience in a way that words alone just can't. Today I want to share with you a selection of some of the best insights my guests have offered about music, and offer a few comments on how I think they all fit together. We start with singer-songwriter Andrew Peterson, who joined me in 2021 to explain the part music plays in his fantasy series, The Wingfeather Saga.
It's pretty obvious, I guess, but the Lily, who's the youngest sister, she's the song maiden. So it goes Throne Warden, High King, Song Maiden is the way the birthright goes. And she discovers after a while that she has this like power. There's a magic in her music that she doesn't really know the rules of. She can't really control it, but music does something. And that's honestly why I got into music, is because I first encountered Jesus through the music of Rich Mullins. I had grown up in church. I was a pastor's kid, went to, VBS and Sunday school and church camp and did the whole thing and believed it. I was kind of fine with the idea of all these things. It felt true enough to me and it was fine. But it wasn't until I heard Rich Mullins sing about Jesus that I kind of collided with the person of Christ and with the truth that He loved me. And so I don't know what it is about music, but like it can, and I should say not just music in general, but for me, songwriting, like a song that is 3.5 minutes long, you can go into it one way and come out on the other side completely different. Yeah. Right? And there's not very many art forms in the world that are quite like that. We all probably know what it's like to be driving down the road and to hear a song come on the radio, and you kind of are half listening at first, and by 3 minutes later you're crying, and you know that you have encountered Sehnsucht or longing, or gotten a little glimpse of the new creation, or understood more about who you were. Like there's just this incredible power that songs have that got me into it, right? It was like songs have always moved me, and so I was like, I want to look under the hood of songs and figure out what is making them do what they do. And so that kind of got me into songwriting in general. So I loved the idea that in these books, songs would have a literal magic to them. They are a way of fighting back at evil in the books, in a very literal sense. And part of the thing that has kept me going in the music career is the fact that I also believe that music is a way to fight back at the darkness and to tell the truth in a way that you can't quite hear in other ways.
The power of music isn't like the power of language. That's one thing I've learned clearly in these conversations on Upstream. It's subtler, more bodily, and more dependent on the conventions and interpretations we bring to it. Yet there's also something objective about it. It taps into reality in a way that we can prove mathematically. It speaks to us on the level of our heartbeats, our breathing, our moods. The music that has developed in the West is particularly helpful as we seek to tell the Christian story and understand the deep ways that story has permanently entered our culture and imagination. I want to share a bit of my recent conversation with theologian and musician Jeremy Begbie, who has spent much of his life plumbing the mystery of music and has some exciting insights. One of the things you point out there is that music has a quality that's very unlike language. In other words, you can't refer directly to things with music. You can't hear a piece of music and go, this is what it denotes, right? Whereas language, you've got nouns and verbs. You know exactly what you're talking about and what the things you're talking about are doing. And so that raises a question for me in light of your experience pre-conversion, that you would have been fascinated with music, but you didn't really have an unanswered question about it. It was sort of burning. You said you didn't come to the end of something and didn't have the answer.
No, I can say absolutely right. I didn't at that stage. I was interested in questions about how music means. That is, how does music become significant for us? Why do we care about it? And you're dead right. Music doesn't have terms which point to things such that we can make assertions about those things, like this is a table. You can't say this is a table in music. That's not what it's about. And that indeed makes it different from language. I thought about those things before I was a Christian, but I never really got very deeply into them because I didn't have any kind of convincing, comprehensive worldview in which to set those things. I didn't have a doctrine of creation, as we would say now, or I would say now. And I certainly didn't have any idea of a personal God who might take delight in our music making and the music we hear. So there was a huge amount missing, but I wasn't really aware at that time of a huge amount missing. I just thought, well, one day I might get answers to these kind of questions, but it didn't worry me very much.
I ask this as a sort of devil's advocate question because I'm thoroughly on your side on this question. But I could imagine someone challenging you on that basis and saying, well, you want to learn certain theological principles from music. In other words, you're trying to read things from music, but how do you know you're not just reading your current faith into them? So if you get like a Buddhist or an atheist comes along and says, I think music teaches my faith, what would you say to that person?
I would say we all come with our presuppositions and our frameworks and our assumptions about reality, from little assumptions to giant assumptions, whole worldviews. Everybody comes with those things, whether they're of faith or of little faith or of Buddhist or Christian, Islam or whatever. We're all going to bring those things to something like music or indeed anything else. So there's no neutral perspective. There's no view from nowhere. As a philosopher friend of mine put it, there's no epistemological Switzerland. There's no neutral territory. And we just got to face up there. So yes, indeed, a Buddhist will come to music and will hear it as a Buddhist with those assumptions. I'm a Christian. I come, of course, with Christian assumptions. So what do we do there? What we do is say, well, look, I invite you to hear this music from a Christian perspective, and I invite you to hear all sorts of things that you might not otherwise hear. But I can't prove that. I can't prove that's the only or the right way of doing it. I can only invite people into that mode of hearing. But we can't pretend we don't have the assumptions or the presuppositions. We've all got those. And so we're all going to hear up to an extent what we like or want to hear. That's just going to happen. On the question of different types of music, yes, anthropologists of music will insist that there's no such thing as music. There are only musics, plural, and many, almost an infinite number of types, depending where you are in the world or depending where you are in history. Fine, that's definitely the case. The kind of music that is dominating our culture and has done so for, well, many decades, if not hundreds of years, but yeah, probably about 500 years, Western culture, but is spreading very fast as well, is called Western tonal music, or just Western music, and it operates according to certain principles. It emerged from about 1500 onwards. And the principles, which I could demonstrate more quickly if I had piano here, but the principles, well, basically tension and resolution. That is, music sets up tensions through the sounds that it makes, little dissonances, little things that have to be resolved. And then it goes ahead and resolves them. And it can resolve them over a long time, over a very short time. So that pattern of tension and resolution is built into everything on your playlist, most likely, and has been for a very long time. That's the way that Western music works. From sounds like this to sounds like that. If you hear this in this culture, you expect, want, desire that. To a set of Mozart, if he heard this, even if he was asleep and 2 stories up, he'd wake up, run all the way downstairs just to play that, because he couldn't bear that unresolved. And writing Western music is about handling the dynamic space between that, or sounds like it, and that. It all depends how you resolve your tensions. Now, tension or resolution, those are two factors, but of course a tension assumes there's something before it, which is not a tension. Something in relation to which the tension can be felt as a tension. I call that equilibrium. So there's an assumed equilibrium, there's a tension, then there's a resolution. And the more colloquial way of putting that would be something like home, away, and home again. In Western music, you'll find this pattern over and over again at all sorts of levels, in all sorts of parameters, home, away, and home again. You start somewhere, you start in a key, typically. You go away for a bit, and then you come back. You start with a melody, you have another melody, you come back to the first melody. That home, away, home pattern.
It's like an oral hero's journey.
A hero's journey, exactly. Well, it's repeated, of course, a huge amount of literature as well, that you start with an assumed, this is how things should be, and then there's some kind of disturbance, and then there's some kind of reconciliation or resolution. Now, of course, what's so interesting about that pattern is it's so basically Christian, indeed Jewish as well. From the Garden of Eden, or from kind of stable equilibrium, to the fall, and then to a resolution of the problem, supremely in Christ, and then in the new creation, the final home, you could say, the final garden. And I find that a fascinating thing. I find it fascinating that in 99% of the hymns and songs we sing, you will find this pattern played out. What was the phrase used? Why there? Why then? I'm not saying it was necessarily all a Christian influence, but that must have had something to do with it. And I think if I were being really courageous, I'd go a little further and say, well, it takes a bit of explaining, doesn't it, when you think that that pattern has become so ubiquitous, so widespread, indeed in many, many cultures, that just it makes you wonder, maybe it's tapping into something profound. Maybe.
Unquestionably, to me, Western music discovered underlying principles that are not arbitrary. These tones are the way they are for a reason, because they have harmonic qualities with one another and so forth. It's not arbitrary. But it leads me to ask, why is music revealing things about the text of Scripture to N.T. Wright? Why is music able to help us dive deeper into a movie like Schindler's List than we ever could if it was just a videotape of this, the same footage with no accompaniment? What is it about music that has this ability, and to what extent is it this tapping into our emotions? To what extent is that tapping into something objective that's not just a kind of subjective manipulation, if that makes sense?
Great question. Great question. Let me just take the first part of that when you were starting up, that it's very important. Listeners to this podcast may have this in their mind. I'm often asked, does music work and operate through merely cultural associations and conventions, or is there something built into it that's tapping into something objectively there? And the answer is, it's both of those. Undoubtedly, it's both of those. Sounds, which are, waves of air just flapping in certain ways, they have certain properties. A string, when you pluck a string, it'll vibrate in a certain way and not other ways, whether you like it or not. So, a string will vibrate across its whole length, but whether you like it or not, it'll vibrate in halves and thirds and quarters, creating what's called a harmonic series. That's just going to happen. That's not culture. That's not social construction or anything. That's just going to happen. And we just got to reckon with that musicians, when they make music, and indeed when we hear it as well, but when musicians are making music, they're not just arbitrarily imposing patterns onto the world. They are tapping into things that are really there and developing them. Now, the important thing, though, you also got to say, you can develop those built-in natural properties in all sorts of different ways. And different cultures and different social groups will tend to develop them in different ways. That's why you get so many different kinds of music. I think you can still point to certain constants in all world music. That's not hard to show. There's the idea of having, for instance, a single tone or note at the heart of a piece of music around which all the others circulate. That's almost universal. There are certain rhythmic patterns that are almost universal in music, patterns that are associated with certain things, like lullabies, for instance, are very similar worldwide. They will tend to be slow. They will tend to have a kind of rocking motion, believe it or not. They will tend to have very small dynamic range. They'll have a small pitch range. In other words, if you're putting the baby to sleep, that's what's going to happen. So there are universal, what's called musical behaviors, almost certainly. And part of that is because of the way our bodies are made and the way the physical world is. Okay, now onto the emotion thing. That's a huge area, but how does music achieve its emotional effect? The jury's out on a lot of issues, but one of the factors, undoubtedly, is because music is tapping into bodily movements and bodily gestures that are associated with certain emotions. So you mentioned Schindler's List, for instance, that great melody. It is full of what's called appoggiaturas. That is, it is full of that sighing.
It's almost like a musical groan.
Exactly. A groan or a sigh. So it's a kind of heaving sound. Now that is universal, and certainly in this culture as well. If you suddenly realize something, you come across something you can't control or that deeply saddens you. So what music, therefore, is doing when it, in something like Schindler's List, is it's taking that bodily expression, vocalization, as the experts would say, and it's systematizing it into a piece of music. So it's not so much that music directly imitates an emotion. It's that music is corresponding in some way to a bodily experience or a bodily movement that's associated with a particular emotion. Now, that applies also to, say, walking pace and the fact that, for instance, sad people will tend to walk more slowly than happy people. And it's generally the case that music that's associated with happiness and positive moods will generally be faster. When you're happy, your heart will beat faster. You're more animated. You'll walk faster. You move faster or whatever. So that it's not surprising if the emotional color, you could say, of happiness is associated, therefore, with fast music. Now, there's lots of cultural variation in all that, but these things are nonetheless the case. And what seems to be happening there, say with the sigh that I mentioned, Schindler's List, you're taking that sigh and it's kind of concentrating it in just 2 or 3 notes. It's giving you a very intense experience of the emotion associated with the sigh that really gets to you. And if you take Schindler's List tune and you take out those little devices, those little sighs, it completely neutralizes the melody and it will cease to have that effect.
I saw a video of you doing this at the piano with the Beatles yesterday.
I could say yesterday was another example. Yeah, the McCartney song Yesterday starts with a these are all appoggiaturas. And I sometimes with audiences, I take out those appoggiaturas and I look at them and I say, would you buy this? And of course not. But I've only changed 2 or 3 notes because I've given it a kind of emotional intensity.
And as your therapist will tell you, there are many ways of resolving your tension. One of the most interesting is this device, and it's called an appoggiatura. That first little note is dissonant with the chord underneath, and it's quickly resolved. Here's another one. Barber? Do you recognize that? Barber Adagio for strings. Here it comes. That's an appoggiatura. John Sloboda of Kiel University, very distinguished music psychologist, done a lot of research on the appoggiatura because he's found that over and over again in music that people say moves them very deeply, you will find a preponderance of appoggiaturas. Take this one. Thank you. Boy, they take a bit of warming up, don't they? There's an appoggiatura. Here's another. Now, I'm going to take out these appoggiaturas. I'm going to fillet them out, all right? So we're just left with everything but appoggiaturas. Would you buy it? Would you know that in 40 years? I changed only 2 little notes.
And that's how you had a nice phrase, Shane, at the beginning about, was it living into
Further up and further in.
further up? Yeah, exactly. That it's taking you into that emotional world of the Schindler's thing, which was so extraordinary. It's taking you right into that so you can experience it much more intensely. And that's, of course, one of the great things about music, that it's almost like it speaks for you sometimes with an intensity that if you're not a musician, you couldn't compose that music, okay? But it does it for you. It does it for you. It helps you feel what you would like to feel or perhaps should be feeling. I had a friend, this is a story I quite often told, a friend who took a dreadful funeral. It's a suicide. Very few people. It was a single mother, and she left her son. That's right, and I think no one else. Anyhow, they were at the graveside, and it was all spoken. The whole thing, the service was spoken, and he took the service. My friend was a pastor, and he was going back to the car. And just as he was going back to leave, the son stood by the graveside and pulled out a set of bagpipes and played a lament for his mother. And he said, we all looked at him, and we were all thinking the same thing, which was, that's it. That's what we wanted to say. This I first came aware of when I was teaching theology here in Cambridge, as a matter of fact, in a seminary. That over and over again, I found myself using musical language. And if there was a piano there, I would use it very naturally because I was thinking and behaving like a musician, the way I do. And musicians who are listening to this will know that very well. They process a lot of the world through music. And I began to see that when I did that, I could get through to things that are there, say, in the New Testament, in a much often quicker, but also, I think, sometimes profounder way than if I used language on its own. It's very important to say this does not mean you run away from the words of the Bible. Some people get nervous at this point and thinking you're making music into a kind of independent source of divine revelation. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that when you stay with Scripture, read it, get inside it, you are oriented towards the living God. And as you are oriented, there are all sorts of other things that will help you live into that orientation much more fully. Now, it could be visual art, it could be sculpture, it could be dance, it could be all sorts of things, but it can also be music. So it's not the music's taking you away from Scripture, it's helping you penetrate more deeply and understand more deeply what's going on there. Perhaps the most striking example of that I discovered early on was concerning the Trinity. That music, the way we hear music, is very different from the way we see the world. The way we hear any sound, actually, but let's say music just for the moment. What happens when I hear a note, if I play a note on a piano, what I hear fills the whole of my heard space. Notes don't occupy bounded locations in what we hear. We don't say a note is there, but it's not there. What we hear fills the whole of our heard space. And if you add another note to that first, now just play 2 notes on a piano, the second note fills the same heard space. It doesn't occupy a bounded location with an edge to it. It fills the whole of that space. But it's the same space as the first note. So in the world that we hear, 2 things can be in the same place at the same time. Now, the world you see, that's not possible. If a painter puts red on a space on a canvas and then comes along with a pot of yellow paint and tries to put yellow in the same space, it'll hide the red, or if the paint's wet, it'll get orange. You can't see 2 things in the same place at the same time as different. And that's just the way we see the world. But the way we hear the world is quite different. We can have 2 things in the same place at the same time. And of course, if you add a third note, then you've got 3 notes in the same space at the same time. What's more, and what's so interesting about that is that with, say, 3 notes on a piano, those 3 strings will be resonating with each other. They will set each other off. They don't occupy bounded locations. There's something called sympathetic resonance going on. So they're actually enhancing each other as you hear them. Now, if we go to the Trinity, it seems to me that a huge number of problems in thinking about the Trinity have arisen because we've relied too much on our eyes. Nothing wrong with vision, but if we over-rely on one sensory mode, like vision, if we over-rely, we're likely to get into all sorts of trouble. So typically with the Trinity, you get the heresy of a kind of Unitarianism on the one hand, where all threeness is gone, or you have tritheism, where you've got threeness, but you haven't got oneness. And there are all sorts of other variations. But usually, if you look at what people try to do with the Trinity, they're thinking visually. I've heard hundreds of Trinity Sunday sermons. In my tradition, we have a thing called the Trinity Sunday, when we suddenly believe in the Trinity for 1 week. And then we all go back to believing in the one God again. And typically in those sermons, you have people bringing out visual illustrations, drain pipes and rabbit's ears and cat's whiskers and all sorts of other fascinating stuff, which, of course, what you're telling your congregation is this is a problem to be solved, and I'm going to solve it with visual illustrations. But a simple 3-note chord does all the work for you almost instantly, and it's also quite pleasurable to listen to. Now, if you go back to John's Gospel, say, you'll see the Father is in the Son is in the Father. Very hard to draw, very hard to visualize, but very easy to hear when you just play 2 notes together. All that in one anotherness language you get in John's Gospel of Father and Son, which of course is the beginnings of the Trinity in the New Testament, right? All that in one anotherness language begins to open out. And you have a very different way of beginning to understand the inner life of God.
One of my all-time favorite conversations on Upstream was with Lincoln Mick and Isaac Horn, the core duo of the Arcadian Wild, a bluegrass folk band that brings gorgeous instrumental work and complex lyrics together in a way that immediately captured my attention a few years ago. Well, I asked them about the power of music, especially why it seems able to communicate what words alone can't. They also explained how, in their experience, lyrical music can take on different meanings for different listeners, becoming something more personal and profound than even the artists themselves intended.
I asked in the opening why music is so powerful. And this is a question that I've mulled over for a long time. And my wife's a musician and she's ventured some theories, but I want to hear what you guys think. Why is it that music has the ability to just cut through your resistance and oftentimes your reason straight to your direct apprehension of truth? Why is it so powerful?
That is a great question. Man, I think it's baffling.
Yeah.
It is. I think we're constantly trying to figure that out as well, because I don't even know that I can answer it clearly for myself. I don't understand why I'm feeling this way all the time. Yeah, it's tough. It does seem to have a really good way of just, it breaks down all the walls and it tears down all the barriers. I think it's so cool how often you can have a really diverse group of people engaging and listening to the same type of music. I think that's really cool.
We were talking about that last night, how it seems that you create a song, right? And then you just release it out into the world and it becomes something different to everybody.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes a different song for every single person that hears it. I don't know. I mean, I think I'd like to believe that it sort of gets at the desire for beauty and truth that is ingrained in each of us, despite how much we're willing to pay attention to that fundamental aspect of who we are as people. And maybe it has a way of just getting straight into that and making it to where you can no longer deny, okay, that is stunning. Right. I don't care what I did this morning. I don't care what I did a year ago or what I think about you. That's something that just, is sort of like a lifeline that is connecting people. And I don't know what it is specifically. Maybe it is just has something to do with the way that music is just ingrained into the fabric of the world, that it's mathematical and scientific and, almost tangible, that it just sort of grounds us into the most, beats us down into the most basic fundamental parts of being a human. Mm-hmm. And those are the very things that connect all of us.
It's kind of like magic.
Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah.
I think all of the creative arts kind of act as an invitation for engagement. But I think music is a little different from a lot of other mediums and forms because it's such a participatory
engagement.
Yeah.
You know, there are so many different disciplines, you know, writing and visual art, painting, sculpting, you know, film, you know, stage acting, and all of these different things. And to, you know, to a certain extent with some of those, we're invited to sort of construct an image in our minds when one isn't explicitly given to us, you know, like reading a book or poetry or something like that. Whereas, you know, others, we're kind of like presented every facet of the experience, and we just kind of get to follow along.
Yeah.
And it's not that there's no work to do. There's interpretive work to do. We have to sort of dig into what's being shared with us and unpack what it means. But I think music is different from those and kind of distinguishes itself because it kind of invites, oh, you can sing along to this, or you can dance along to this. To a certain extent, it's almost another language unto itself. You know, people who don't speak the same language, they, you know, at least in the West, for the most part, like we mostly have the same 12-tone dialect, and we kind of speak the same harmonic language. You know, in Eastern music, it's like a totally different world, and it's mind blowing, and really it's a whole different other system that's really sophisticated. And I don't have as much experience with that, but you know, there are so many people who I couldn't converse with in words, but I could, you know, have something to say to them in music, or, you know, vice versa. They could speak to me.
It's so cool how it just sort of like invites anyone to sit down and participate. All you need is a certain level of commitment. You just got to mean it.
Mandolin, a banjo, a beard.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
right.
pretty much it.
Those are your instruments.
Yeah.
And no shoes.
Right. I want to talk about a few of the songs here, and we'll play some key clips in the for our audience here. But let's start with the Ballad of Donnie Jean. And you talked about this last night when you played it. This is actually a tribute to someone in real life. Tell us about that song. Now that we'll hear a little clip here, and then go ahead and tell us about that.
Donnie, you're a fine young man. You're hoping to take the hand of some sweet thing who'll understand what this world's about. She's careful with a clever mind, impervious to pick up lines. Just slow down and give her time. I bet she'll come around. Donnie, don't give up on her. She won't give up on you. She's the kind of woman that only speaks the truth. She'll give you blue-eyed babies and she'll raise them real good too. Donnie, don't give up on her. She won't give up on you.
So that song was inspired by my wife Shelby's grandfather. His name was Donnie Jean Wood. He was a real person. And he just had a really sweet story that I didn't really learn about until shortly after he died. Shelby and I got married in his front lawn in November of 2015. And that was a really wonderful, beautiful day. And he passed away the following April. And so I only got to know him for a very brief period. But he was a really sweet man. By the time that I met him, he had a pretty aggressive onset of Alzheimer's and was having a lot of trouble just remembering things and just navigating daily life. But his wife, Joan, was really sweet and tender and loving and supportive of him. And it was neat to watch her love him so well at that point in their relationship. After he died, there were just a few stories that were circulating through the family that I hadn't heard before. And they were just really sweet and touching. And one of the great ones was just when he first met Joan, his wife. I think he was 17 or 18 and she was 15 or something like that. And he was picking up her older sister to take her somewhere. And then she came outside and said, "Hey, can you give my kid sister a ride too to school?" And so Joan got in the back seat of the car and they dropped the older sister off, and Donnie Jean like looked in the rearview mirror at Joan and said like, "Hey, do you want to come up here and sit with me?" And she's like, "No, I'm fine right back here. Thank you." And she like let him chauffeur her. And he was like the flashing, his handsome blue eyes was like not working on her at first. But he was persistent, and they began seeing each other regularly. And he asked her to marry him, and she said no the first time. And it wasn't like, "I don't like you." It was just like, "I'm a child, and this is insane." But he continued to be persistent and asked her again, and she eventually said yes. And
I was really struck by his unwillingness to relent, and he didn't give up on pursuing her. And they led a really beautiful life together and had children and raised a family. And I think that same intensity with which he pursued her in the beginning, she devoted to him in his declining days. And so I think she refused to give up on him at the end of his life. And I was just really struck by that. And every time I'm going to keep it together. Every time I like tell a little bit more of that story at a show, for some reason, just like knowing that the audience now knows a little bit more about it, makes it more difficult for me to make it through. And I'm like, I can't like sing it. But yeah, I really loved his story. He lived very simply and loved very profoundly. And I said last night at the performance when we played this song, I think a lot of people these days tend to get married and then they just do the same thing that they might have intended on doing with their life, whether they had been married or not. It doesn't necessarily reorient their world or their universe. And his family was his life. They were his hobby. Like he had a job and then his hobby was his family. And that's amazing. Like, I just think that reorientation of your perspective and your whole life is a really unique and wonderful thing you don't see a lot of.
Don't we all have people in our past and our ancestry who we can say that about? I mean, one of the things that's been brought home to me being a father is the meaning of God's commandment to honor your father and mother. I mean, it just seemed like something they browbeat you with when I was a kid. Do what we say. But now I understand. Oh, it's about the sort of wonderful priority that God has set up, where we give birth to one another. We bring one another into existence. We're not like angels. We're not just all on the scene at the same time as a peer group. We have this hierarchy of honor and descent. And just as you want your kids to look back on you and honor what you did for them and how you love them and cover up your flaws, forgive those things and thank you for the great good that you did. I have tried to make a habit of doing that for my parents and grandparents as well. And this song just captures it so well. And it's especially poignant, I think, in a time when, I talked with Carl Trueman yesterday, and he has this idea of cultural amnesia, that we're taught to basically hate and disregard the past. And one of the aspects of, bluegrass music that evokes the past is the sound. The other aspect is what you put into it lyrically. And you guys have obviously put this love of the past and the people in the past in your music. And you're saying, this guy, he toiled away on his family. He invested everything in his family, and he was never famous for it. He never had a crowd cheering for him. But you know what? He's the reason we're here. And he obviously gave you so much without even knowing him that much.
Very thankful to him.
Yeah. Let's talk about another song here. And there's so many good ones. It was so hard for me to cut it down, but this one really blessed me deeply. And we talked about this last night, Isaac, and it's called Rain Clouds. And we'll play a little clip for our audience here.
I'm being followed by the rain cloud. My clothes are soaking up the pain that keeps pouring down. Too much more and I may drown. I'm being followed by the night sky. It stole away my sight. It seems I have lost my way. I need someone to be my guide. Listen to my voice. Close your frightened eyes. Hide behind my love for you. Fear's only a choice, one that we all must make someday. So no, you're not alone in this.
First question I have is, what are the rain clouds in Rain Clouds? What's that symbolic of?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think I mentioned last night how it's one of the cool things about being a songwriter, sort of what we touched on previously, where once you finish writing a song, record it, and release it, it becomes a different song for everybody that hears it. And that was definitely, that's one of those songs that I don't think whenever I was writing it, I don't think that I grasped what the song was yet. I think I wanted to write a good song and I wanted to write an honest song, but first and foremost, I wanted to write a song that would impress a girl, you know? and I wanted to seem especially deep and introspective or whatever.
You know, I think that's why Andrew Peterson picked up a guitar in the first time. He kind of admitted that to me.
Oh yeah, I mean, honestly, I think if that wasn't the case, if that wasn't the case, I don't know.
Anyway,
But
here's Wonderwall.
yeah, right. Hey there, Delilah. I mean, it's turned into a song that means so much to me simply because of the stories that I've heard from other people and the way that it has impacted them. And so that song has sort of evolved in my own mind. And it's definitely evidence that I'm not in charge of my music, you know, and that there certainly is this higher power that is constantly has a hand on it and is making sure that despite my motivations, his will and the truth is still there. But yeah, I mean, I think I would say that the rain clouds are just, I mean, I immediately this image of, you know, like that, like classic cartoon where there's like somebody standing on the side of a street and like a small rain cloud comes over and it's like just raining on that person,
right, yeah.
You know, and they like pull out their umbrella and there's holes in it or whatever. So there's like nothing that they can do, like can like, there's no shield from this. And like, whenever they look around, they're like, okay, this is just me. And it's like right here. And it's following me like everywhere I go. Whenever I walk, it's like this cloud's following me, and it's fully surrounding me. And like everything's wet, like everything's drenched. It's just like, okay, there's no escaping this. And at a certain point, you just, after like trying all these different methods of escape, you just sort of like give up and like resign yourself to it. And you're like, okay, I guess this is my life now. So I guess I would just describe it as anything that feels like that, any sort of weight-bearing burden that is placed on your shoulders and that in the moment feels like it's just like sand and like water that's just like finding its way into every single crack of your life. I think that it can be a lot of different things specifically. And it is for, you know, whenever I think back on different parts of my life and the way that song has evolved, there are different struggles and different conflicts and things I look back on and it's like, okay, that was that song. Okay, but this also was, and so is this.
Rain Clouds and Andrew Peterson's We Will Survive. Both of those like companions in my experience and my personal piety.
Because there's that hope there.
Right.
The hope at the end.
Why is that hope so important? I mean, and how does music uniquely offer it? Because it feels like I can read all of the didactic teaching that I want, reassuring me of hope and of the fact that this rain cloud doesn't have the final word, whatever it is. And yet music can cut through and give you a real taste of that hope where you're at right in that moment. Why?
Well, I think what music does, especially whenever it accompanies lyric, is just sort of create this color palette or sort of like emotional, you know, soundscape and context. You know, like you can have a lyric that's like, I don't know, I left the house this morning. Yeah. And it's like, if it's under a certain type of music, it can just be like, all right, that's a nothing line or whatever. You're just literally leaving the house. But also if it's under a certain type of music, it can be like, okay, like you're departing from like home and a place of security. I don't know. I just totally made that up. I don't know if that connected at all.
Exactly what you mean.
But yeah, I think that music has power to like create context for a lyric and sort of like give it legs to stand on. So that, yeah, this sort of like conceptual idea that is just a sentence that you listen to and you're like, okay, yeah, I got it. Now all of a sudden it has like the power to sort of like move forward and like, you know, resonate within you. And I think it's so cool. And I think there's a certain like responsibility that comes with that. You know, I think that there's just sort of getting into like a little bit of the like philosophy of writing music and like the choices that we make. I think there's a certain level of pandering that you can do musically that is like really easy to do. And they're like, okay, this is a happy song, I'm going to put happy music to it. Or this is a sad song, I'm going to put sad music to it. And that's like the obvious, like on the nose thing to do. And sometimes that needs to happen. Like sometimes that's what the song calls for. But I think it's really cool the way that you can sort of refocus songs by, okay, this is a happy song, but what if I put this sort of like somber undertone? Like how does that sort of like recolor and reshape the way that it's heard? I'm getting really far away from your question about hope and why that's really important. But I think that goes back to like whenever we write songs, trying to tell the truth.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's a need to just, what you need to do in the context of this song is just present this sort of like helpless, dark scenario and say, this is where I am. This is like, and that's it. I don't have anything right now beyond that. But I think it's inherent to the story that we find ourselves caught up in, the story of the gospel, that we have the ultimate hope in Jesus it's here, it's happened, it's already like it exists, and it's impossible to ignore it no matter how far away we might feel from it. And so I think that is something that we just really try to pay attention to. And whenever we sort of get down into the ditches, to be like, okay, hold on, like it's all going to be okay.
Yeah.
Because it is.
This is Shane Morris with exciting news about the 2024 Colson Center National Conference. We've expanded the CCNC experience to provide greater opportunities for you to learn, apply, and engage, so you can be equipped to live courageously wherever God has placed you. Enhanced breakout sessions will be catered to specific vocations and interests. With the help of experienced Colson Center coaches, these interactive sessions will translate main session teachings into practical application for your unique context. Along the way, you'll have more time to link arms and strategize with other Christians who are facing the very same challenges. Take advantage of our lowest ticket price, which is being offered at a 50% discount before rates go up on October 31st. Register today at colsonconference.org. Musicians are a breed of their own. I often ask singers and songwriters about their creative process. How do they come up with their ideas? What comes first, the music or the words? Do they plan everything out, or does it happen by accident? And how can music change the meaning of words so that lyrics we might not think twice about suddenly take on heartbreaking or life-changing significance? Let's listen to what David Radford of the Grey Havens had to say about that when I had him on in the early days of the Upstream podcast.
I think the intuitive thing is interesting that you mentioned, because we just got finished writing a full-length album that we are working on right now. And songwriting's so interesting. I mean, it's in that some of the lyric choices, you need the music to go with it. So if you're just write down these words, as a poem even, and submit it to somebody and be like, what is this? And it's like, I don't know. It felt like everything else was wrong. It's kind of I'm kind of pontificating now in songwriting, but there's that famous thing about, I think it was Michelangelo or some famous sculptor. He just looks at a block of marble for like months. And, right. He's like figuring out what parts of the marble weren't the statue of David or whatever. And I feel like I'm the opposite. Like when I'm writing songs, I'm like, I don't know. He saw David in there in the marble and he dug him out, beautifully. And I look at a piece of like a song and I see the marble and I know there's something in there, but I don't know what it is. And so I take my hammer and chisel or whatever, and I'm like, just trying to figure out like what's in there. And I don't want to break whatever's in there. So I'm just going to like take everything and maybe I'll discover like there's a hand in there. Okay. So maybe this thing is I'm going to go through that a while, or maybe it's totally the opposite. And it's just totally by intuition is a good word, and what we use to kind of navigate as our compass maybe in the process. But yeah, I'm looking over our lyrics just recently, like this makes no sense, but somehow we're going to use it anyway. So
music has always played a central role for the people of God, going all the way back to the early days of Israel's history. The most obvious legacy music has left on our faith is the Book of Psalms, 150 songs of worship, lament, imprecation, and messianic prophecy, all set over the centuries to various types of music. The habit of singing these inspired songs has, sadly, fallen out of favor in the modern church. And I recently spoke with a guest who thinks that that's a shame and a scandal. Pastor, podcaster, and musician Brian Sauvé joined me to talk about an album of psalm settings he released called Even Dragons Shall Him Praise. He also explains how his church began singing psalms in worship and offers tips for how your church can too.
The Psalms. I opened this conversation up with a reminder that, hey, there's this giant book in the middle of our Bibles, and in some ways it's sort of neglected, or maybe we look at it with a little bit of puzzlement. We're not sure what we should be doing with it. Most Christians, I think, read the Psalms and just read them like they're words on a page, and we forget so easily. But for those little headings where it's like a song of ascent or something, or for the choir, or these little weird musical notations like Selah, that we're not even sure what that means exactly, last I checked, that these are songs. They're for singing. They're for a choir. They're for worship by the people of God. What do we miss or neglect about the book of Psalms? And then what drew you especially to set these to music?
Before I served as a preaching pastor, for a long time, I primarily served as a worship leader in the church. So musically leading worship. And I realized somewhere in my mid to late 20s, probably 27 years old or so, that I've grown up in the church, even led the people in singing week after week after week, and had never to my memory sung an entire psalm. So, reading my Bible, get to Ephesians 5, Colossians 3, these passages that we see this apostolic command to sing psalms to one another. And I immediately was convicted that here I am picking songs week in, week out. And I'm sure we've referenced them. I'm sure many hymns are inspired by passages from the Psalms, of course, but had never led the people to sing a whole psalm. So, basically just did what every modern does and said, Google, how do you do that? And discovered this whole world of psalm settings and metrical psalms and choral settings and Latin settings, and just got completely sacred harp and got absolutely sucked in and decided I'm going to do my best with my modest musical abilities to try and make some settings, because I couldn't find many that were really well adapted to the musical style that we were at that time, at least, singing together on Sundays, where you have typically a guitar leading guy with an acoustic guitar. And so I thought, well, I'm going to try to set some for my church, recorded them to help them learn the songs, and somehow Twitter got a hold of it and started listening, and I just kept plugging away. Eventually, we switched over to singing from a hymnal and a psalter and 4 parts with a piano and a lot. It's changed quite a bit at our church, but I found that there were just many, many churches in a similar situation. They wanted to sing the Psalms, but they didn't know how, and they were starting to realize that they were missing out on a great storehouse of treasure. And they said, help us. Let's figure this out together. So that's really a lot of the motivation for the project overall.
I want to talk about that storehouse of treasure in a second, because I absolutely agree with you. I think it is. But I did want to ask how similar this is musically to what you guys sing in your church, and whether being able to, use this for worship in a church is part of the project.
Yeah, some of the psalm settings that I've produced were directly from our singing. Psalm 3 is an example of that. I originally set that, made a new long meter tune that we could sing it to. Psalm 98 from one of my earlier albums is actually just a setting from a hymnal that we'd used, and I kind of adapted it for guitar. So it's a good mix. Some of the songs that I've set, especially on this recent album, Psalm 16, Psalm 93, Psalm 3, I particularly shaped more for people who wanted to lead them in a congregation from like an acoustic guitar sort of scenario. And then others of them are more meditative. I mean, some of them are more like Tyler Childers meets the Psalms kind of Coulter Wall vibe. And those I would actually discourage a worship leader from trying to make into a corporate setting, because you'd probably be setting your people up to fail in actually singing them, which would be disappointing. So kind of a mix.
Yeah, I mean, when you set out to do something like this, and I'm not a musician, my wife is a pianist, and so she just kind of educates me here and there. But I'm an avid consumer of, I guess, certain genres of music. I won't tell you which, because then I'd be super embarrassed. But it's not Taylor Swift, just so you know. I'm not a huge Taylor Swift fan.
Yeah, good.
Nothing like that. But there's a difference between the music setup that you have to produce a compelling album that's fun for listening, and the setup that you have to sing as a congregation. I mean, these two things are different. There's a lot more simplicity to the second than the first. And I don't think that I'd necessarily want to pop in my earbuds and listen again and again to congregational singing. There are exceptions, of course, but they are different things. So it totally makes sense that there's a difference there. When it comes to actually singing the Psalms in a worship setting, and I know we need to ask this because we're tapping into a real tradition here and encouraging the resuscitation of that tradition, I guess. What would you recommend for like actually opening up the Psalms and singing them as a congregation? Is there a book, a resource?
Yeah, I always encourage churches, and even if you are the furthest away from feeling like you could sing a whole song this Sunday, 100% every church in America tomorrow could sing a whole psalm, and everyone in the congregation would know how to do it easily through metrical psalms. Metrical psalms it's just a musical term. It's for putting words to meter, meaning lines have a certain number of syllables in a pattern. Common meter is the most common, where you see a line with 8 syllables, then 6, then 8, then 6. The song Amazing Grace is in common meter. So you can go to something like the 1650 Scottish Psalter. Those Presbyterians are very reliable in helping you sing the Psalms if you want to. And you could find the 23rd Psalm in common meter and sing it to the tune of Amazing Grace tomorrow. The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. He makes me down to lie. And everyone would sing it, not clunky, not difficult. And to me, that's the starting point for most churches is pick a few of these psalms they're shorter, they have good handles on them. Find a metrical tune that you already know. And you probably already know many more than just Google metrical tunes. And you can find whole psalters full of tunes and metrical settings. And they're easy to adapt, whether you sing in 4 parts with a piano or with a band and a guitar. And that's actually one of, my big aims with this kind of project is to encourage Christians that whether in family worship or your church or just you driving in your car, you'll probably already have the tools to get your feet wet in singing whole psalms. So for sure that, I would say metrical psalms. From there, I mean, one of the resources we use at our church, we established a few years ago a weekly psalm sing. So we get together every Tuesday night. We have a potluck. And then for just 45 minutes, we go up in the sanctuary and we break into a group of basses, tenors, altos, and sopranos and help people find which they are. And then we use an app called Sing Your Part, which is like a $5 app in the App Store. I think it's only on iPhone right now, but it can help you isolate parts in a couple different hymnals that you can get online and help you walk through learning your parts. And we went from a church that had never sung anything in parts, never sung a whole psalm, to exclusively, I mean, we sing not exclusive psalm, but we sing 60% or so whole psalms on Sunday morning in 4-part harmony, some of them quite complex, fuguing tunes with the men singing at different parts than the women, and this kind of American fuguing tune tradition. And we learned how to do that when I didn't know how to read music yet. Most of us had no idea what we were doing. And in about a year, we said, okay, let's kick the guitar out. Let's start singing every week like this. And we've never looked back. And we were a normal church, just like most evangelical churches today that don't have this kind of tradition. And I would say you can do it.
The Psalms make this obvious, but there are few things music does better than help us come to terms with life in this fallen world and to express to God and to each other how we feel about that fallenness. But what if music can help us understand what it means to live under God's mysterious providence and even make sense of evil and why God allows it? I want to close this episode with a few thoughts Jeremy Begbie offered on the role of music in storytelling and how the church could benefit greatly from taking it more seriously.
But I think music can teach us something about being held in the story, held in the flow of the music. We realize there is a resolution, it's not come yet, but we're nevertheless held here, and it's worth hanging on. Music tells it's worth hanging on in the midst of the irresolution. It teaches us the art of patience in many ways, music, and I think that's a very important thing. I mean, just think about it. With music, you can play the music a bit fast, but you can't rush through it. You can't say of a U2 song, well, this normally takes 4 minutes, but we're going to give you the economy version in 30 seconds. I mean, Come on. Part of its meaning is making you wait. You have to go at its speed. In the same way, in so many ways, we have to go at the speed that God has made things in the world. 9 months for a pregnancy, or whatever. That waiting is part of what we're on earth to do, hard and very, very painful as it can be.
Dr. Begbie, one of the other things that you've mentioned, and I think this one just resonates with me with a special power, is this ability that music has to make sense of discord morally or naturally in the world, of pain or what we would look at as disorder and destructive influences, and to turn those into something else. And so I'm fresh off of an interview as we speak here with Austin Freeman, and he just wrote a book called Tolkien Dogmatics, Theology Through Mythology with the Maker of Middle-earth. And of course, any treatment of Tolkien and theology is going to draw on the Silmarillion and that amazing creation myth at the beginning that Tolkien starts with, where the world is sung into existence by God and the high angels, the Ainur. And one of the moments in there that just is unforgettable is the rebel angel attempting to corrupt the music by introducing his own themes and his own strains and his own sounds. And they're cacophonous. They clash with the more beautiful music because he's trying to set up himself as a composer, as a deity, essentially. And God responds not by telling him, hey, shut up, you're ruining the music. He tells him, in essence, whatever you do, it doesn't matter because I'm going to turn that to something more beautiful in the end. And your strains will actually be resolved in a way that makes the whole thing more beautiful, and you can't do a thing about it. And that's like Tolkien's doing exactly that theodicy, and bringing out exactly that power that music has.
I was going to say, if you ask a jazz musician, do you ever make mistakes? They'll probably say, yes, all the time. But the key thing is what you do with them. And the miracle of good improvisation is that whatever comes up, if something, say, radically wrong, as we might say, or discordant, or potentially disruptive, then the question is, well, what a good musician knows how to always knows how to make something out of that, even out of the very worst. So that's built into improvisation. It's built into actually most composition as well, even when you're laying out a piece and writing out, every note of it. How you resolve dissonance and discord is part of the great skill of music. And that, of course, is an extraordinary model for what God has done supremely in the raising of Jesus from the dead and in his promise of a new creation, when even the worst, the very worst, will somehow be turned to the very best, and something even greater will come out of that. I think we need to be a little bit careful, though. I put in a caveat there. If we're not careful, we might suggest that God deliberately put in evil and sin to make the world a bit more interesting, in the way that a composer might put in a discord in order to make the thing more interesting. Let's be very careful about that. Sin and evil is a total interruption that by very definition doesn't make sense. And it's certainly God is not the author of evil. So let's be very careful. Otherwise, we get into an awful situation where we might say something like that we might look back on history and say, oh, I can see why the Holocaust had to happen now. No, it didn't have to happen. It's an appalling intrusion of evil. God, in his providence, may and will, because of the resurrection, we know God will make something even out of something so unspeakably horrific as that, yes. But that doesn't make evil part of the purposes, the original purposes of God. It was not supposed to happen. And that's just a very important thing to say when we're using the musical analogy.
Mm-hmm. Music tells us these things too, in a way that even a child understands. And so
makes you feel them. It makes you feel them.
Right.
Exactly.
It makes you feel them. We were talking about The Lord of the Rings, and most people have seen the Peter Jackson movie adaptations. And I think my favorite part about those, as much as I like them as movies, is the music. It's Howard Shore's score that goes along with it, because it's one of the most brilliant extended works of film music that I've ever heard. And you see, or you don't see, you hear and sense the moral message through the music. So when there's an evil character or a dark moment or something, you've got these musical conventions, minor key and instrumentation. There's a lot of clanging metal noises, things like that. And it's telling you something's wrong, something's not right. Isn't it amazing that intervals and timbre and things can do that to us?
Yeah, undoubtedly. And, indeed, there are certain kinds of dissonance and discord that we know neurophysiologically will interfere with our perception of harmony and other things in ways. And, of course, film composers know exactly how to use that. It's interesting you started with film this in your intro to this, because I think if I had my way, I would take all church music composers, of which I'm one, right across the board of all styles or whatever, and I would make it compulsory for them all to do a month's apprenticeship with a film composer. Because the techniques that they're using, the kind of musical language, for instance, that they use is very much wider than you'll find in the typical church. And yet people still understand it. So there's nothing elite or highfalutin about it. People understand that film music language, as you say, instantly. But it's interesting when you go to church, how can I put it, the vocabulary, the repertoire massively shrinks. And so I would go to work with a John Williams or a whoever who knows exactly what they're doing, and at their best can give us also a certain amount of room. There's manipulative music, but when a film composer also gives you a bit of room for response, but nevertheless creates a kind of general mood, we need to learn from that. You think about the sheer variety of emotional colors you find in Scripture or in the Psalms alone. And yet when we come to church, that it can be massively restricted, massively pared down in a way that I think is regrettable, which is a very English way of saying wrong. That's right.
English understatement there. It means you're catastrophically wrong. It's very regrettable. That's right. That's the way to say it. I hope you enjoyed this special episode of Upstream, looking back on the mystery of music through some of the exciting and insightful conversations I've had on the podcast. Join me in the future for more episodes like this as I tie together insights from many different guests and think harder about what God has taught me through this podcast, what it means to go upstream, and why Christians need a bigger and older worldview. Thanks for listening. Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media or by visiting upstream.colsoncenter.org.